They believed the house was haunted, unaware the voice had watched them since childhood. You might think this is just another ghost story, something meant to pass the time around a fire. But what happened in this stretch of Tennessee woods wasn't a choice. It was a slow, agonizing transformation of a home into a prison. By the time we're done, you'll see that the ground beneath this town doesn't just hold history. It holds a cold, deliberate weight that hasn't moved in 2 centuries. And it's still listening. Imagine a place where the horizon is swallowed by the suffocating thickness of the hardwoods. In the early 19th century, the settlement near the Red River, in the area we now know as Adams, wasn't a bustling town. It was a collection of homesteads scattered like seeds across a landscape that didn't particularly want them there. Life moved at the speed of a horse and plow. It was a cycle of bone-deep exhaustion and a faith so rigid it felt like iron. You didn't just live in these woods. You negotiated with them. Every day was defined by the rhythm of survival, the scent of turned earth, the rhythmic thud of the axe, and the low hum of voices in small, candlelit rooms where the Bible was the only window to another world. The people who settled here were hardy, driven by the promise of fertile soil, but there was an unspoken agreement among them. They kept their eyes on their own furrows and their doors barred at night. It wasn't because of crime or war, it was the crushing weight of the isolation. When the sun dipped behind the ridges, the darkness didn't just fall, it settled over the valley like a thick, damp wool blanket. You could walk for miles and hear nothing but the sound of your own heartbeat and the unsettling rustle of leaves that didn't seem to follow the direction of the wind. There was a peculiar density to the air, a stillness that felt crowded even when you were completely alone. The community was built on a foundation of shared labor and shared silence. Neighbors knew each other's business, yet they rarely spoke of the things they felt in the corners of their vision. They focused on the mundane, the price of corn, the health of the livestock, the sermon on Sunday morning. They anchored themselves to the tangible world because the alternative was to acknowledge how vulnerable they were in the middle of this vast, untamed wilderness. The trees seemed to lean inward, and the river moved with a sluggish, secretive grace. It was a place where time didn't pass so much as it accumulated, layering year upon year of sweat and prayer onto the red clay. In those early years, before the names and the stories began to circulate, the land held a strange, suffocating equilibrium. Nothing felt dangerous. Everything felt heavy. It was the kind of weight that makes you look over your shoulder, not because you see something, but because you feel the space behind you has suddenly, inexplicably changed. It didn't start with a scream or a grand revelation. It started with a sound that simply shouldn't have been there. You have to understand that in a house built of heavy timber and stone, noises are expected. Wood groans as it cools. The wind whistles through the gaps in the masonry. But what began to happen on the Bell property was different. It was the sound of something trying to get in, or perhaps something trying to get out from within the very walls themselves. It began as a faint scratching, like claws dragging across the exterior siding, but when the doors were flung open, the porch was always empty. The scratching soon migrated. It moved from the outside to the floorboards, then to the bedposts. Imagine trying to sleep while a rhythmic, persistent gnawing echoes just inches from your head. At first, the family did what anyone would do. They looked for a rational culprit. They tore up boards looking for rats. They checked for branches scraping against the roof. But there was nothing. The confusion was worse than the noise itself. When you can't find a physical cause for a physical sound, your sense of reality begins to fray at the edges. You start to doubt your own senses, and then you start to watch the faces of your family members to see if they are hearing it too. The pattern was the most unnerving part. It wasn't a one-time occurrence. It became a nightly ritual. It grew from scratching into a heavy thumping, then into the sound of a stone being ground against stone. Then came the voices, not clear words, but a low, guttural muttering that seemed to hang in the corners of the rooms, just out of reach of the candlelight. It was a sound that felt like it was being squeezed through a throat that wasn't human. The fear didn't stay confined to that one house. In a community that small, a secret is a physical weight, and eventually, it had to be shared. They didn't go to the authorities to report a crime. They went to their neighbors to ask for their sanity. They invited friends and local leaders to sit in the dark and listen. And they did. Men who prided themselves on their stoicism and their common sense sat in those quiet rooms and felt the hair on their arms stand up as the knocking responded to their questions. This shared experience changed the atmosphere of the entire valley. It wasn't a sudden panic. It was a slow-motion collapse of certainty. The neighbors didn't offer solutions because they didn't have any. Instead, they brought their own anxieties into the fold. The local religious leaders tried to frame it through the lens of scripture, searching for a name for the formless dread, but the entity, whatever it was, didn't seem to care about their rituals. It just continued to exist, persistent and indifferent to their prayers. The collective psychology of the area began to shift. They were no longer just a group of farmers. They were a group of witnesses. The silence of the Tennessee nights, which used to be peaceful, now felt like a predatory waiting. People started seeing the same shadows, hearing the same echoes in their own homes. The lack of an explanation created a vacuum, and fear rushed in to fill it. They needed a label. They needed a way to categorize the impossible so they could pretend to understand it. This is the moment where a private struggle becomes a public burden. This is how a city prepares to create a symbol. The name didn't arrive all at once. It wasn't found in an old book or brought by a traveler from a distant land. Instead, it grew out of the soil of atoms like a weed, nourished by the whispers of people who were desperate to give their fear a shape. When the scratching and the knocking finally gave way to a voice, a high, piercing, and articulate sound that could quote scripture as easily as it could hurl insults, the community reached a breaking point. They could no longer refer to it as the trouble or the noise. They needed a label that could contain the impossibility of what they were witnessing. They began to call it the Bell Witch. But the name was a consequence, not an explanation. It was the town's way of trying to domesticate a nightmare. By calling it a witch, they were trying to slot the inexplicable into a category they understood from their own folklore and faith. There were, of course, different versions of the story that began to circulate almost immediately. Some claimed it was the vengeful spirit of a neighbor named Kate Batts, who believed she had been cheated in a land deal. Others argued it was a family trouble that had manifested into a physical force, or perhaps an ancient entity that had been disturbed by the clearing of the forest. Yet, despite the conflicting theories, every witness agreed on one chilling element: the presence. This wasn't a mindless haunting or a series of random occurrences. It was a conscious, observant entity that seemed to know the private sins and secret thoughts of everyone who entered the Bell home. It didn't just exist in the house, it occupied the air around it. It would engage in theological debates with preachers and sing hymns with the family, all while manifesting a cold, invisible violence against those it targeted. The strangest part was its selective nature. While the entity focused its most brutal attention on John Bell and his daughter, Betsy, it treated the rest of the community as an audience. It wanted to be heard. It wanted its presence acknowledged. It didn't terrorize the entire town in the traditional sense. It didn't burn barns or blight the crops. Instead, it sat in the center of their world and watched them, reflecting their own anxieties back at them. The legend was born because the people of Adams couldn't look away. They needed the story to explain why their world felt so fragile, why the darkness in the woods seemed to have found a voice. It wasn't the monster. It was the warning. It was a sign that the boundaries they thought protected them, the walls of their homes, the strength of their faith, were far thinner than they had ever imagined. Winter in Middle Tennessee has a way of stripping the world down to its coldest, most jagged bones. In December of 1820, that chill didn't just sit on the fields. It seemed to seep through the heavy timber walls of the Bell home, settling into the marrow of everyone inside. For years, the family had lived in a state of siege, But there was a prevailing hope, perhaps a naive one, that the entity was merely a tormentor, a cruel presence that thrived on exhaustion and fear but stopped short of finality. That hope ended in a small, quiet room as the sun struggled to rise over the frost-covered valley. John Bell had been declining for months, his body failing under the weight of a neurological affliction that the entity mocked with rhythmic, guttural cruelty. On the morning of December 19th, he fell into a stupor from which he would not wake. When his son went to the medicine cupboard to find the vial of elixir prescribed to him, he found instead a strange, dark bottle that no one recognized. The liquid inside was smoky and unfamiliar. When the family questioned the air, the voice they had come to loathe responded with a chilling, prideful clarity. It claimed it had brought the vial. It claimed it had finally finished him. To prove the point, the liquid was tested on a cat, which dropped dead almost instantly. John Bell followed the next morning. The impact on the community of Adams was a profound, paralyzing shock. Up until that moment, the Bell Witch had been a local anomaly, a terrifying curiosity that neighbors discussed in low tones over fences and pews. But a death, a suspected poisoning carried out by an invisible hand, changed the nature of the fear. It was no longer a story you told to shiver. It was a reality you lived in. The funeral was one of the largest the county had ever seen, not just out of respect for the man, but out of a desperate, collective need to see him into the ground. They say the entity didn't stay silent during the service. It allegedly sang ribald songs and laughed as the dirt hit the coffin, a final desecration that left the mourners in a state of hollow, vibrating terror. This is the point where the atmosphere of the town shifted permanently. The curiosity vanished, replaced by a heavy, communal silence. People stopped visiting the farm to witness the phenomenon. The homestead, once a place of modest prosperity and hospitality, became a site of mourning and a symbol of human helplessness. When the entity finally announced its departure shortly after, promising to return years later, it didn't bring relief. It left behind a vacuum. The family was shattered, the father was gone, and the daughter, Betsy, was left with the scars of a psychological trauma that would never truly heal. The legend changed in that moment. It was stripped of its mystery and replaced with a grim, historical weight. It moved from the realm of folklore into the realm of local trauma. The neighbors didn't talk about it as a witch anymore. They talked about it as a tragedy that had happened to people they knew. The story was no longer about what might be in the woods. It was about what had actually happened in that bedroom. This is where stories stop being entertainment. It is the moment when the unexplained stops being a puzzle to be solved and starts being a scar that a community is forced to carry. The air in Adams didn't feel lighter once the voice stopped. It felt empty, like a house that has been gutted by fire, leaving only the blackened shell of what used to be a life. Today, the town of Adams, Tennessee, carries the weight of its history with a quiet, practiced grace. If you drive through the area now, you'll find a landscape that hasn't changed as much as you might expect. The rolling hills are still there. The Red River still snakes through the valley with a slow, muddy indifference, and the woods remain thick and deceptively deep. But there is a distinct divide in how the legend is consumed. To the outsider, the story is a commodity, a reason to pull off the highway, visit the reconstructed cabin, or take a lantern-lit tour of the Bell Witch Cave. For the tourist, the fear is a temporary thrill, something to be discussed over lunch and then left behind in the rearview mirror. For the people who actually live here, the relationship with the past is far more complicated. It isn't lived out in screams or grand displays, but in the small, subtle choices that define life in a town with a memory this long. There is a specific kind of respect that locals pay to the land, an unspoken understanding that some places are better left alone once the sun begins to drop below the treeline. You won't often find the longtime residents lingering near the old property boundaries or the riverbanks after dark. It's not necessarily a belief in ghosts that keeps them away. It's a lingering psychological discomfort, a hereditary caution passed down through generations. They know that this isn't just a story. It's the reason a family was destroyed and a patriarch was buried in a field of whispers. In Adams, the legend isn't just something you read about in books. It is part of the atmosphere, as much a part of the geography as the limestone bluffs. While the rest of the world uses the name for entertainment, the town holds it as a somber inheritance. There is a sense that the events of 2 centuries ago didn't truly end. They just settled into the soil, waiting. The museums and the markers provide a barrier, a way to package the terror into something manageable, but the true legend exists in the silence of the nights, when the wind carries a sound that doesn't quite belong to the trees. Some stories never leave the places where they were born. In this valley, the past doesn't just haunt the present, it anchors it. In the end, it doesn't truly matter if there was a spirit hidden in the limestone of Adams, Tennessee, or if the tragedy was born from the fractured psyche of a family crushed by the weight of their own isolation. The legend wasn't built on proof, it was built on a need. The community needed to name the scratching in the walls and the voices in the dark because the alternative, the idea that life can simply turn cruel and nonsensical without any cause, was too much to bear. By creating the Bell Witch, they gave the void a face. They turned a private nightmare into a shared history, ensuring that the suffocating weight of those Tennessee nights finally had a purpose. But as you move away from this story, the silence remains. We tell these tales to convince ourselves that there is a firm boundary between the mundane and the monstrous, yet the history of Adams suggests that this boundary is an illusion. The story is just the skin we wrap around a fear that has no name. As you sit in your own home tonight, listen to the rhythm of the walls and the stillness of the air. You might think you're alone, but remember, a legend is only born when the silence becomes too heavy to carry. Perhaps your city is just waiting for its turn to speak.